Some promises are worth dying for, especially the ones we make to the people we've lost. Isaac Ramsey had sworn to a dying woman that he'd protect her daughters, and now he stood watching them kneel bound in the town square, facing death. The ruthless land baron Fletcher Rawlins gave him a simple choice: marry one sister by sundown, or watch both hang at dawn. Catherine and Beth looked up at Isaac with tears in their eyes. He was just a weathered blacksmith now, but years ago he'd been something else entirely. The townspeople gathered around, waiting to see what he'd do. Isaac's hands shook as he remembered their mother's final words. In the town where justice had died long ago, one man's impossible decision would change everything. But what if Isaac had a plan that nobody saw coming? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Millbrook's dusty main street, where Isaac Ramsey had walked the same path to his forge every day for the past 5 years. His blacksmith hammer, worn smooth by countless hours of honest work, hung heavy at his side, a tool that had replaced the weight of guns he'd once carried with deadly precision. At 58, Isaac's broad shoulders still carried the strength of his younger years, though silver now threaded through his dark hair and deep lines mapped the weathered landscape of his face. The town of Millbrook had grown around the promise of prosperity, nestled in a valley where the railroad was supposed to come through. Instead, it had become a place where hope went to die slowly, strangled by the iron grip of Fletcher Rawlins, a man who collected debts in blood and measured his worth by the fear in other men's eyes. Fletcher owned the bank, the general store, the saloon, and most of the surrounding ranchland. What he didn't own outright, he controlled through intimidation and carefully placed bribes. Isaac's forge sat at the edge of town, close enough to serve the community, but far enough away to maintain the solitude he'd grown to cherish. The rhythmic ring of hammer on anvil had become his meditation, each strike driving away the memories of a man he'd tried to bury. The townspeople knew him as a skilled craftsman who could repair anything from horseshoes to wagon wheels, a quiet man who kept to himself but never turned away anyone in need of help. The school bell rang across the valley, its clear tone cutting through the morning air like a promise of better days. Isaac paused in his work, listening, as he always did, when Catherine Morrison rang that bell. She'd been teaching Millbrook's children for 3 years now, ever since she'd arrived with her younger sister Beth, 2 young women trying to build a life in a place that seemed determined to crush such dreams. Catherine had fire in her eyes and steel in her spine, qualities that reminded Isaac painfully of her mother. At 26, she possessed the kind of fierce intelligence that made grown men uncomfortable, and the gentle patience that could coax learning from the most reluctant student. She fought for every child in her classroom as if they were her own, often using her own meager salary to buy supplies the town couldn't afford. Her sister Beth was quieter but no less remarkable. At 23, she'd appointed herself the town's unofficial healer, learning medicine from old Dr. Vincent Kane and tending to anyone who needed care, regardless of their ability to pay. Where Catherine's strength showed in her voice and stance, Beth's revealed itself in her gentle hands and knowing eyes. She could set a bone as skillfully as she could calm a frightened child, and her small clinic above the general store had become a refuge for the town's suffering. Isaac had known their mother, Margaret Morrison, before consumption took her 3 years ago. Margaret had been the kind of woman who could make a man believe in redemption, who could see the good buried deep beneath layers of sin and regret. She'd been a widow when Isaac met her, raising 2 daughters alone after her husband died in a mining accident. Isaac had been courting her quietly, carefully, building toward a future he'd never thought possible for a man with his past. The day Margaret died, she'd called Isaac to her bedside. Her once bright eyes had been dim with fever, but her grip on his hand had been surprisingly strong. "Promise me," she'd whispered, her voice barely audible above the rattle in her chest. "Promise me you'll watch over my girls. They're going to need someone strong, someone who understands what it means to fight for what's right. Isaac had made that promise without hesitation, sealing it with a blood-stained letter that Margaret had pressed into his palm, a letter that now lay hidden beneath the floorboards of his forge, next to the weapons he'd sworn never to touch again. In that letter, Margaret had written about her suspicions regarding Fletcher Rawlins, about the strange symptoms that had preceded her illness, about her fear for what would happen to her daughters in a town where justice wore Fletcher's face. Fletcher Rawlins had arrived in Millbrook 6 years ago with enough money to buy respect and enough cruelty to maintain it. He was a man in his 50s with pale eyes that seemed to look right through people, calculating their worth like items on a ledger. His expensive suits and polished boots marked him as an outsider, but his willingness to use violence had quickly established his place in the local hierarchy. Fletcher's ranch sprawled across thousands of acres of prime grazing land, much of it acquired through foreclosures and intimidation. He employed a dozen hardened men, whose job descriptions included debt collection, property enforcement, and ensuring that Fletcher's version of law prevailed in Millbrook. The territorial authorities rarely ventured into this remote valley, leaving Fletcher to rule like a medieval lord over his domain. Isaac had watched Fletcher's rise to power with the careful attention of a man who recognized a predator. There was something familiar about Fletcher's methods, a calculated brutality that spoke of experience in darker trades than cattle ranching. Isaac's instincts, honed by years of reading Dangerous Men, told him that Fletcher was building towards something larger than simple wealth accumulation. The corruption had spread through Millbrook like a disease. Sheriff Tom Morrison, no relation to the sisters, had been Fletcher's first major acquisition. A weak man drowning in gambling debts, Morrison had traded his badge's integrity for Fletcher's financial salvation. He now served as Fletcher's enforcer, using the law as a weapon against anyone who dared challenge the new order. Dr. Vincent Kane remained one of the few men in town who couldn't be bought. In his 70s, with nothing left to lose and too much medical knowledge to ignore, Kane had become Isaac's unlikely confidant. He'd been the one to tend Margaret during her final illness, and he'd been the one to whisper his suspicions to Isaac after the funeral. Kane suspected poison, though he could never prove it, and his medical expertise had provided the foundation for Margaret's documented concerns. Ruth Anderson ran the Silver Dollar Saloon, with the practical wisdom of a woman who'd survived frontier life through cunning and careful alliances. She served Fletcher's men their whiskey while listening to their conversations, gathering intelligence that she shared with those few townspeople still willing to resist. Her saloon had become neutral ground, a place where information flowed as freely as the liquor. Pastor David Wells had arrived in Millbrook the same year as Isaac, a man seeking his own form of redemption through service to others. His small church provided sanctuary for those seeking spiritual counsel, and his sermons carefully balanced calls for justice with practical concerns about survival. Wells understood that courage without wisdom was merely another form of suicide in Fletcher's domain. The town's children attended Catherine's school with an eagerness that spoke to their hunger for something better than the fear their parents lived with daily. She taught them reading and arithmetic, but more importantly, she taught them to dream of futures beyond Millbrook's dusty streets. Her classroom had become a symbol of hope in a community that had nearly forgotten what hope looked like. Beth's clinic served a similar purpose for the town's physical ailments. She'd learned to set broken bones and stitch wounds, skills that were unfortunately necessary in a place where Fletcher's justice often left marks on those who challenged it. Her gentle presence provided comfort to families who had nowhere else to turn when sickness or injury struck. Isaac's forge stood as a monument to the possibility of change. The man who'd once been known as the Ghost Rider, one of the most feared outlaws in 3 territories, now spent his days creating rather than destroying. His hammer shaped horseshoes and tools instead of his guns shaping graves. The transformation hadn't been easy. There were nights when the weight of his past sins pressed down like physical pain, when the urge to solve problems with violence whispered seductively in his ear, but Margaret had shown him another way. Her faith in his capacity for good had planted seeds of change that had slowly taken root over the past 5 years. Isaac had learned to find satisfaction in the honest sweat of physical labor, in the gratitude of customers who received quality work at fair prices, in the gradual building of trust within a community that had initially viewed him with suspicion. The sisters represented everything Isaac had come to value about his new life. They embodied the hope and goodness that Margaret had seen in him, the future she'd believed was possible even for a man with blood on his hands. Watching them build their own lives in Millbrook, Catherine fighting for education and Beth healing the sick, had convinced Isaac that redemption wasn't just possible but worth the daily struggle it required. Fletcher's growing interest in the Morrison sisters had been subtle at first. Small gestures of supposed kindness, offers of financial assistance that came with unspoken strings attached, compliments that lingered too long and carried implications beyond their words. Isaac had watched these overtures with growing unease, recognizing the patient, stalking behavior of a predator circling his prey. The town's banker, Henry Caldwell, had approached Isaac several months ago with concerns about Fletcher's land acquisitions. Caldwell was a meticulous man who kept careful records, and those records showed a pattern of suspicious foreclosures and forced sales that had concentrated an enormous amount of property in Fletcher's hands. More troubling were the federal land grants that Fletcher had somehow secured, documents that gave him claim to territories that should have remained in territorial custody. As summer faded into autumn, Isaac had begun to sense a change in the air. Fletcher's men had grown more aggressive in their patrols through town. The pressure on local businesses had increased, with more frequent tax collections and protection fees that bled the community dry. Sheriff Morrison had started asking questions about Isaac's past, probing inquiries that suggested someone had been researching the Ghost Rider's history. Isaac kept Margaret's wedding ring hidden in his forge, alongside her letter and his buried weapons. He'd bought the ring 3 years ago, planning to ask for her hand in marriage once her illness passed. The ring had never found its intended finger, but Isaac couldn't bring himself to sell it or put it away. It represented the life he'd almost had, the happiness that had slipped away like smoke in the wind. Now, standing in his forge, with the morning sun streaming through the doorway, Isaac could feel the familiar weight of approaching storm. His instincts, sharpened by years of survival in violent places, told him that Fletcher was moving towards some kind of endgame. The sisters had become too prominent in the community, too beloved by people who should have learned to keep their heads down and their hearts closed. The sound of running footsteps on the dirt road broke Isaac's contemplation. Young Tommy Hartwell, one of Catherine's students, came racing toward the forge with tears streaming down his face. The boy was gasping for breath, his small chest heaving as he tried to form words through his panic. "Mr. Ramsey," Tommy sobbed, grabbing Isaac's arm with desperate strength. "You have to come quick." They took Miss Catherine and Miss Beth. Fletcher's men came and took them right out of the schoolhouse and the clinic. They said, Isaac's blood turned to ice in his veins. The hammer slipped from his nerveless fingers, clanging against the anvil before falling silent on the forge floor. The boy's words seemed to echo in the sudden stillness, each syllable hammering against Isaac's chest like physical blows. "What did they say, son?" Isaac's voice emerged as barely more than a whisper, but Tommy heard the deadly quiet beneath the words. "They said, 'Fletcher wants to see you in the town square at noon,'" Tommy whispered. "They said you have to choose." Isaac closed his eyes, feeling the familiar darkness rising within him like floodwater breaking through a dam. The peaceful blacksmith's life he'd built over 5 years crumbled away in an instant, revealing the predator that had never truly been buried. Margaret's promise echoed in his memory, and Isaac knew that the Ghost Rider's final ride was about to begin. Isaac's boots struck the dusty ground with purpose as he followed young Tommy toward the town square, each step awakening instincts he'd tried to bury beneath 5 years of honest labor. The peaceful morning had shattered like glass, revealing the jagged edges of a violence he'd hoped never to face again. Behind him, his forge stood abandoned, the fire slowly dying as the hammer lay forgotten beside the cold anvil. The kidnapping had been swift and brutal, orchestrated with the precision of men who understood the value of shock and overwhelming force. Catherine had been in her schoolhouse when Fletcher's men arrived, teaching her afternoon lessons to a classroom full of children who looked up to her with the trust that only the young could offer so freely. According to Tommy's breathless account, 3 armed men had kicked down the door without warning, ignoring the screams of terrified students as they dragged Catherine from behind her desk. She fought them. "Mr. Ramsey," Tommy said, his small voice breaking with admiration and horror. "Miss Catherine hit one of them with her wooden ruler and told us all to run. But they were too strong, and they had guns. She made us promise not to follow, not to try and help. She was trying to protect us, even when they were hurting her." Isaac's jaw tightened as he imagined Catherine's fierce spirit railing against her captors. Margaret's eldest daughter had inherited her mother's courage, along with her stubborn refusal to surrender in the face of injustice. That same courage had now put her in mortal danger, just as Isaac had always feared it would. Beth's capture had been even more calculated in its cruelty. Fletcher's men had brought a supposedly wounded outlaw to her clinic, a man clutching a blood-soaked shirt and begging for medical attention. Beth's compassionate nature had made her an easy target. She'd opened her door without hesitation, driven by the healer's instinct to help anyone in pain. The moment she'd let them inside, the wounded man had grabbed her while his companions secured the building. Mrs. Henderson from the general store saw them carry Miss Beth out. Tommy continued, his words tumbling over each other in his haste to tell everything. She said Miss Beth was fighting too, but they'd tied her hands behind her back. They threw both sisters into a wagon and drove them straight to the town square. Mr. Fletcher was waiting there with more men, all armed and ready. Isaac could see the town square ahead, a patch of scraped earth that served as Millbrook's heart and gathering place. Usually, it hosted market days and community events, but today it had been transformed into a stage for Fletcher's twisted theater. A crowd had already gathered, drawn by the spectacle and held by a mixture of curiosity and fear. Isaac recognized most of the faces: shopkeepers, farmers, families he'd served over the years, all of them watching with the helpless fascination of people witnessing a disaster they couldn't prevent. The sisters knelt in the center of the square, their hands bound behind their backs with rough rope that had already begun to chafe their wrists raw. Catherine's dark hair hung loose around her shoulders, disheveled from her struggle, but her green eyes still blazed with defiant anger. Beth's gentler nature showed in the tears that streaked her dirt-stained cheeks, though she held her head high with quiet dignity. Both women bore the marks of rough handling, bruises darkening on Catherine's cheek. Beth's lips split and swollen from a careless blow. Fletcher Rawlins stood behind them, like a showman presenting his grand performance, his expensive suit unmarked by the violence his men had employed. He was a man who understood the power of spectacle, who knew that public demonstrations of force created lasting impressions on potential opponents. His pale eyes swept the gathered crowd with satisfaction, counting the fear and submission he saw reflected in their faces. "Citizens of Millbrook," Fletcher called out, his voice carrying easily across the square. "We're gathered here today to witness justice, not the weak, ineffective justice of territorial law, but the kind of practical justice that keeps communities safe and prosperous." Isaac pushed through the crowd, ignoring the gasps and whispers that followed his approach. He could feel the weight of every gaze, the recognition rippling through the assembled townspeople as they realized the Ghost Rider himself was walking among them. Some faces showed hope, others fear, and a few displayed the calculating interest of people wondering if they were about to witness a legend's final chapter. Fletcher smiled when he spotted Isaac, the expression cold and predatory. "Ah, Mr. Ramsey, so good of you to join us. I was just explaining to our neighbors why we find ourselves in this unfortunate situation." Isaac stopped 10 feet away from Fletcher, his hands hanging loose at his sides. To the untrained eye, he appeared calm, almost casual, but those who knew violence recognized the coiled tension in his posture, the way he balanced his weight on the balls of his feet. This was a man preparing for action, even though the odds were heavily stacked against him. "Let them go, Fletcher," Isaac said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent square. "Your quarrel is with me," Fletcher chuckled, shaking his head with mock disappointment. "Oh, Isaac, may I call you Isaac? I feel like we've become such good friends over the years, watching each other from across this little valley. You see, this isn't about quarrels or disputes. This is about justice. These two young ladies have been spreading lies about me, poisoning the minds of good, honest citizens with their wild accusations and unfounded suspicions." Catherine lifted her head, her eyes blazing with fury. "The only poison in this town comes from you, Fletcher Rollins. Everyone knows what you did to our mother, what you've been doing to this whole community." Fletcher's smile never wavered, but something cold and dangerous flickered behind his eyes. He gestured casually to one of his men, who stepped forward and backhanded Catherine across the face, with enough force to snap her head sideways. Beth cried out, straining against her bonds as she tried to reach her sister. "You see what I mean?" Fletcher continued as if nothing had happened. "Disrespectful behavior, unfounded accusations, general disruption of the peace. These girls need firm guidance from a strong husband who can teach them proper conduct." Isaac took a step forward, his right hand instinctively moving toward where his gun would have hung in the old days. The motion was subtle, but Fletcher noticed it, his smile widening with genuine amusement. "Which brings us to today's entertainment," Fletcher announced, his voice rising to address the entire crowd. "Mr. Ramsey here has a choice to make. A simple choice, really, the kind that separates civilized men from animals. He can choose one of these lovely sisters to be his bride, a proper Christian marriage, performed right here in our town square. The chosen sister will live a comfortable life as Mrs. Ramsey, protected and provided for as any good woman deserves." The crowd stirred uneasily, sensing the trap hidden within Fletcher's seemingly generous offer. Isaac felt his chest tighten as he recognized the true depth of Fletcher's cruelty. This wasn't just about the sisters, it was about breaking Isaac's spirit, forcing him to participate in his own moral destruction. "And the other?" Isaac asked, though he already knew the answer. "The other will hang at dawn," Fletcher replied cheerfully. "A tragic but necessary consequence of her refusal to accept lawful authority. I'm afraid there's simply no place in Millbrook for women who won't learn their proper place in society." Beth's soft voice cut through the square's tense silence. "Isaac, don't let him do this to you. Our mother wouldn't want you to sacrifice yourself for us." Fletcher reached into his jacket and withdrew a silver locket. Margaret's silver locket, the one she'd worn every day until her death. He dangled it from his fingers, letting it catch the sunlight as it swayed back and forth like a hypnotist's pendulum. "I found this in young Catherine's possession," Fletcher said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "She was clutching it when my men brought her in, probably thinking of her dear, departed mother. Such a lovely woman Margaret was. So unfortunate that she had to leave us so soon." Isaac's vision went red around the edges. The locket had been Margaret's most treasured possession, a gift from her first husband containing photographs of her daughters as small children. She'd been buried without it, and Isaac had always wondered what had become of that precious keepsake. Now he knew. Fletcher had taken it, adding one more violation to his list of sins. "You son of a—" Isaac started forward, but stopped as Fletcher's men raised their rifles. Now, Fletcher chided. "Let's keep this civilized. You have until sundown to make your choice, Isaac. Choose one sister to marry, or watch both of them dance at the end of a rope. Those are your options. There are no others." Dr. Kane pushed through the crowd, his medical bag in his hand and determination written across his weathered face. "At least let me tend to their injuries," he called out. Whatever else happens here, they don't deserve to suffer unnecessarily. Fletcher considered this request, then nodded graciously. Of course, Doctor. We're not monsters here. Tend to the lady's comfort by all means. But remember, any attempt to help them escape will result in their immediate execution. As Dr. Kane knelt beside the sisters, checking their injuries with gentle hands, Isaac caught the old physician's eye. Kane's subtle nod told Isaac everything he needed to know. The doctor was ready to help, regardless of the personal risk. Round the square, Isaac could see other faces in the crowd. People who'd benefited from his honest work over the years. People who remembered what it meant to stand for something beyond mere survival. Fletcher's plan was brilliant in its simplicity. Force Isaac to choose, and no matter what he decided, the blacksmith would be broken. Choose Catherine, and gentle Beth would die. Choose Beth, and fierce Catherine would hang. Refuse to choose, and both would perish while Isaac lived with the knowledge that he could have saved one of them. But Fletcher had made one crucial mistake. He'd assumed that Isaac Ramsey, peaceful blacksmith, was all that remained of the man who'd once terrorized 3 territories as the Ghost Rider. He'd forgotten that some kinds of violence, once learned, never truly fade away. Isaac reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper, the blood-stained letter Margaret had pressed into his palm as she lay dying. The paper was worn soft from years of handling, the ink faded but still legible. He unfolded it slowly, reading the familiar words that had haunted his dreams for 3 years. "My dear Isaac," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then my fears have proven true. Fletcher Rawlins is not the man he pretends to be, and my daughters are in danger. I've documented my suspicions in my medical journal, hidden where only Beth will think to look. Promise me you will protect my girls, even if it means becoming the man you once were. Some promises are worth any price, including our souls." Isaac folded the letter carefully and returned it to his pocket. Around him, the crowd waited in breathless silence, sensing that they were witnessing a moment that would define not just Isaac's future, but the fate of their entire community. "I'll give you my answer at sundown," Isaac said finally, his voice carrying a quiet authority that made Fletcher's men shift nervously. "But understand this, Fletcher, you've made this personal now. You've involved innocent women in a game that should have stayed between men." Fletcher's laugh rang out across the square, but there was a note of uncertainty beneath the bravado. "Is that a threat, Isaac? Because if it is, I should remind you that you're outnumbered 20-1. Isaac smiled then, and it was the smile of a man who'd once made grown outlaws wet themselves with fear. "No threat, Fletcher. Just a promise. The same kind of promise I made to their mother." He turned and walked away, leaving the crowd buzzing with nervous energy and speculation. Behind him, the sisters watched with a mixture of hope and terror, understanding that their fate now rested in the hands of a man who'd spent 5 years trying to forget how to kill. Isaac's forge felt like a tomb when he returned, the dying embers casting dancing shadows across tools that suddenly seemed foreign to his hands. The peaceful sanctuary he'd built over 5 years had been contaminated by the violence spreading through Millbrook like poison in a well. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, letting his eyes adjust to the dimness, while his mind wrestled with memories he'd spent years trying to suppress. Margaret's face haunted him as he moved deeper into the forge, her gentle smile overlaying the brutal image of her daughters kneeling bound in the dirt. She'd been the anchor that kept him moored to his new life, the living proof that a man could change if he had sufficient reason. Her faith in his capacity for good had sustained him through the dark nights when his past sins pressed down like physical weight. When the urge to solve problems with violence whispered seductively in his ear, the floorboards near the back wall looked identical to all the others. But Isaac's fingers found the slight depression that marked the hidden catch. He'd built this cache during his first year in Millbrook, telling himself it was merely prudent preparation, while hoping he'd never need to disturb the weapons sleeping beneath his feet. The boards lifted away to reveal an oiled cloth bundle, wrapped with the care of a man who understood that his life might someday depend on the contents. Inside the cloth lay the tools of his former trade, a matched pair of Colt revolvers that had earned him his reputation as the Ghost Rider, a rifle that could drop a man at 300 yards, boxes of ammunition, and a collection of knives designed for close, quiet work. Each weapon bore the marks of careful maintenance. Isaac had cleaned and oiled them regularly, unable to fully abandon the habits that had kept him alive through his violent years. The revolvers felt strange in his hands after so long, heavier than he remembered, yet somehow more natural than the blacksmith's hammer he'd wielded that morning. His fingers traced the worn grips, remembering the countless hours he'd spent practicing his draw until it became faster than thought, more instinct than conscious action. The Ghost Rider's legend had been built on speed and precision, on the ability to end conflicts before his opponents realized they'd begun. A soft knock at the forge's entrance made Isaac's hands freeze on the weapons. He looked up to see Dr. Vincent Kane standing in the doorway, his medical bag clutched in weathered hands and concern etched deep into the lines of his face. The old physician's eyes took in the hidden cash. The weapons spread across Isaac's workbench, and the transformation that was already beginning to show in the blacksmith's posture. "I treated their injuries as best I could," Kane said quietly, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. "Cuts and bruises mostly, though Catherine has a nasty knot on her head from when they dragged her out of the schoolhouse. Beth's lip will heal, but she's more shaken than she's letting on. Both girls are stronger than they look, but Fletcher's men aren't being gentle with them." Isaac carefully wrapped the revolvers back in their cloth, though he made no move to return them to their hiding place. "How long do you think we have before Fletcher grows impatient with waiting?" "He'll stick to sundown," Kane replied, with the certainty of a man who'd spent decades reading human nature. "Fletcher's always been a showman. He wants the whole town watching when you make your choice, wants everyone to see what happens when someone challenges his authority. The spectacle is half the point for him." The old doctor moved closer, lowering his voice even though they were alone. "Isaac, I know what you're thinking, and I know what you're planning. I've seen that look before in war and in other dark places. But you need to know there are people in this town who remember the stories about the Ghost Rider. Some of them are scared of what you might become, but others are ready to help if you'll let them." Isaac looked up sharply. "This isn't their fight, Doc. I won't have innocent blood on my hands because of promises I made." "Innocent blood is already on Fletcher's hands," Kane replied firmly. "Margaret's death wasn't natural, Isaac. I never had proof, but I knew. The symptoms, the progression, it was poison, administered slowly over months. Arsenic, most likely, probably slipped into her tea or food whenever Fletcher had the opportunity. He killed her because she was building evidence against him, and because she gave you something he wanted." The words hit Isaac like physical blows. He'd suspected, had nightmares about the possibility. But hearing it confirmed by the one man whose medical opinion he trusted completely brought the rage bubbling up from depths he'd thought sealed forever. His hands clenched into fists, the careful control he'd maintained for years, threatening to snap like overstressed rope. "Why didn't you tell me before?" Isaac's voice emerged as barely more than a growl. "Because I knew what you'd do with that information," Kane replied. "Margaret made me promise to tell you only if her daughters were threatened. She knew that her death might be the price of keeping you anchored to your new life, and she was willing to pay it if it meant you stayed the man she'd helped you become. But she also knew that if Fletcher ever came for Catherine and Beth, you'd need to know the truth to make the right choices." Isaac's mind reeled as the implications crashed over him. Margaret's death hadn't been the cruel work of disease, but the calculated murder of a woman who dared to stand against Fletcher's expanding power. The guilt he'd carried for 3 years, the sense that he should have done more to save her, was nothing compared to the fury building in his chest like a wildfire, a commotion outside. The forge drew both men's attention. Through the small window, Isaac could see a group of people approaching, not Fletcher's armed men, but townspeople he recognized. Catherine's students led the group, their young faces streaked with tears but set with determination. Behind them came parents, shopkeepers and laborers, people who'd benefited from the sisters' kindness over the years. Isaac opened the door to find young Tommy Hartwell at the front of the group. The boy's chin raised with the kind of courage that reminded Isaac painfully of Catherine's fierce spirit. The other children clustered around Tommy, Sarah Chen from the laundry, Miguel Santos, whose father worked the livery stable, little Annie Murphy, whose mother cleaned houses for wealthy families. "Mr. Ramsey," Tommy said, his voice steady despite his obvious fear. "We want to help save Miss Catherine and Miss Beth. They've been good to all of us, and we can't just stand by and watch them get hurt." Behind the children, their parents shifted nervously, torn between pride in their offspring's bravery and terror at the thought of challenging Fletcher's authority. Isaac recognized the conflict. These were decent people who'd been ground down by years of oppression, but who still retained enough conscience to know when lines had been crossed. "Son," Isaac said gently, kneeling to put himself at eye level with the boy, "I appreciate what you're trying to do, but this isn't a game. Fletcher's men are killers, and they won't hesitate to hurt children if they think it serves their purpose." "We know," said Sarah Chen, her small voice carrying surprising strength. "But Miss Catherine taught us that sometimes you have to stand up for what's right, even when it's dangerous. She said that courage isn't about not being scared. It's about doing what needs to be done, even when you are scared." Isaac felt his chest tighten at the words. Catherine had been teaching these children more than reading and arithmetic. She'd been planting seeds of resistance, showing them that submission to evil was a choice, rather than an inevitability. The irony wasn't lost on him that a woman trying to build a peaceful future was now trapped because of lessons that might have come from his own violent past. Miguel's father, Ramon Santos, stepped forward from the group of adults. He was a small man, made smaller by years of hard labor, but his eyes held the same determined gleam as his son's. "Senor Ramsey, we remember the stories about you from before. The Ghost Rider, they called you. A man who fought against those who preyed on the innocent. Maybe it's time for that man to ride again." Other voices joined in, a chorus of support that surprised Isaac with its intensity. These people had watched Fletcher's gradual takeover of their town with the helpless rage of the powerless, but the sisters' kidnapping had finally pushed them past their breaking point. They were offering to follow a legend into battle, despite knowing that many of them might not survive the confrontation. "Fletcher has 20 armed men," Isaac pointed out, trying to make them understand the odds they faced. Professional killers who've been preparing for this kind of fight their entire lives. Most of you have never fired a gun in anger, never looked into another man's eyes while deciding whether he lives or dies. Or isn't like the stories, especially when it comes to your own front door. "Then teach us," called out Ruth Anderson from the back of the group. The saloon keeper had arrived with her rifle in hand and fire in her eyes. "You know how to fight these kinds of men. Show us how to give them a taste of their own medicine." Pastor David Wells emerged from the crowd, his usually gentle face grim with resolve. "Isaac, I've counseled patience and turning the other cheek for years, but there comes a time when evil must be confronted directly. If we don't stand now, when will we? If we don't fight for Catherine and Beth, who will we fight for?" Isaac looked around at the faces surrounding him, young and old, frightened but determined, united by their love for two women who'd brought hope to a hopeless place. These weren't professional fighters or seasoned outlaws, but they were people who'd reached the end of their tolerance for injustice. They were offering him something he hadn't expected, the chance to use his violent skills in service of genuine good. Dr. Kane placed a weathered hand on Isaac's shoulder. Margaret knew this day would come. She wrote about it in her journal, the one she told Beth about. She knew that Fletcher would eventually push too far, force a confrontation that would require you to choose between the man you'd become and the man you'd been. She believed you could be both, a protector who fought with purpose rather than for profit. Isaac felt the weight of decision settling on his shoulders like a familiar coat. The peaceful blacksmith's life was ending, burned away by Fletcher's cruelty and his own awakening conscience. The Ghost Rider was stirring from his 5-year slumber, but this time he wouldn't ride alone. "All right," Isaac said finally, his voice carrying new authority. "If you're determined to do this, we'll do it right. But understand, once we start down this path, there's no turning back. Fletcher won't show mercy to anyone who stands against him, and neither can we." The crowd stirred with nervous energy, fear and excitement mingling in equal measure. Isaac was about to transform from the town's quiet blacksmith into something far more dangerous, a leader of rebellion, a teacher of violence, a man preparing to wage war for the souls of 2 women and the future of an entire community. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the town square as Isaac approached the sisters under the watchful eyes of Fletcher's guards. His heart hammered against his ribs as he drew closer to Catherine and Beth, both women looking up at him with a mixture of hope and desperate fear. The crowd that had gathered to witness Fletcher's spectacle had grown throughout the day. Drawing curious onlookers from the surrounding ranches and settlements, Isaac knelt in the dirt before the sisters, ignoring the rifles pointed at his back. Up close, he could see the full extent of their injuries. Rope burns on their wrists, bruises darkening on Catherine's jaw, the split in Beth's lower lip that had reopened from her attempts to speak comfort to her terrified sister. These were Margaret's daughters, the children he'd watched grow from pigtailed girls into remarkable women, now reduced to pawns in Fletcher's twisted game. "Isaac," Catherine whispered, her voice hoarse from hours of dust and fear. "Don't do what he wants. Don't let him break you the way he's broken everyone else. Our mother, she wouldn't want you to sacrifice yourself for us." Beth's gentler voice joined her sister's plea. "There has to be another way. You taught us that violence only breeds more violence, that good people find peaceful solutions to their problems. Please don't become something you'll hate just to save us." Isaac's throat tightened as he heard Margaret's own words echoed in her daughter's voices. She'd believed in redemption, in the possibility that even a man with blood on his hands could choose a better path. But she'd also understood that sometimes the sword had to be drawn to protect the innocent. That peace was only possible when good people were willing to fight for it. "I made a promise to your mother," Isaac said quietly. His words meant only for the sisters' ears. "I swore to protect you no matter what it cost." "That promise doesn't end just because the price has gotten higher." Fletcher's voice boomed across the square, interrupting the moment of intimacy. "Time for a demonstration of good faith, Isaac. I want you to understand the seriousness of your situation, the reality of the choice you face. Guards, bring Catherine forward." 2 of Fletcher's men hauled Catherine to her feet, dragging her toward a makeshift gallows that had been erected near the town's old oak tree. The noose swayed in the afternoon breeze, its rough hemp fibers casting twisted shadows on the ground below. The crowd stirred uneasily as the reality of Fletcher's threat became undeniably clear. "You see," Fletcher continued, his voice carrying the casual tone of a man discussing the weather, "this isn't just theater. The gallows are real, the rope is strong, and my resolve is absolute. Choose one sister by sundown, or watch both of them hang. Those are your only options." Isaac rose slowly, his hands hanging loose at his sides. To the casual observer, he appeared calm, almost resigned, but those who knew violence recognized the predatory stillness that had settled over him. This was the Ghost Rider emerging from 5 years of peaceful slumber, awakening to face a threat that demanded his particular skills. "I want to speak with them privately," Isaac said, his voice carrying clearly across the square. "If I'm going to choose which one lives, I deserve a few minutes to say goodbye to the other." Fletcher considered this request, his pale eyes calculating the potential risks and benefits. After a moment, he nodded graciously. "Of course. A condemned woman deserves her last rites after all. But make it quick. We have a schedule to maintain." Isaac approached the sisters again, kneeling between them so his body blocked the guard's view of his hands. As he pretended to comfort the women, he slipped something small and metallic into Catherine's palm, Margaret's wedding ring, the one Isaac had carried next to his heart for 3 years. "Listen carefully," he whispered. his voice barely audible even to the sisters. "This ring. Your mother was going to wear it when we married. I want you to have it now, Catherine. Whatever happens today, remember that love is stronger than fear, that promises kept are worth any sacrifice." Catherine's fingers closed around the ring, her green eyes flashing with understanding. Despite her fear, despite the impossible circumstances, she was already planning, already fighting. Margaret's fierce spirit lived on in her eldest daughter, unbroken by Fletcher's intimidation. "What about you?" Beth asked, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Even if we survive this, Fletcher will never let you live in peace. You'll spend the rest of your life running from his vengeance." Isaac smiled then, the expression carrying echoes of the dangerous man he'd once been. "I've been running from my past for 5 years, Beth. Maybe it's time to turn around and face it head on." The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted their whispered conversation. Isaac looked up to see Fletcher returning from his ranch, accompanied by additional men, professionals by the look of them, hired guns with the cold eyes and casual violence of career killers. Fletcher was taking no chances, surrounding himself with enough firepower to handle any conceivable threat. "I see you've brought reinforcements," Isaac observed, rising to face Fletcher directly. Fletcher's smile was cold and triumphant. "Just ensuring that today's festivities proceed smoothly. You see, Isaac, I know more about your reputation than you might think. The Ghost Rider was formidable in his day, but that day was years ago. You're older now, softer, weakened by domesticity and conscience. These men, on the other hand, are in their prime and unencumbered by moral considerations." Isaac studied the new arrivals with the practiced eye of a man who'd spent years evaluating potential threats. They were good. He could see it in their positioning, their weapons maintenance, the way they watched everything while appearing casual. But they were also overconfident, secure in their numerical advantage and Fletcher's intelligence about Isaac's supposed decline. "You might be right," Isaac agreed, his tone conversational. 5 years of honest work have definitely taken their toll. I'm not the killer I used to be. But there's one thing you might not have considered, Fletcher. And what's that? Isaac's smile was gentle, almost grandfatherly, but his eyes held depths that made Fletcher's hired guns shift nervously. The Ghost Rider never worked alone. He had friends, allies, people who believed in what he was fighting for. And sometimes, Fletcher, the most dangerous enemy is the one who has nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. As if summoned by his words, figures began emerging from buildings around the square. Dr. Kane appeared from his clinic with his rifle in hand. Pastor Wells stepped out of his church, flanked by members of his congregation. Ruth Anderson positioned herself on the saloon's second-story balcony, her weapon trained on Fletcher's men. But the most surprising support came from an unexpected source. Sheriff Tom Morrison limped into the square, his shoulder bandaged from Isaac's earlier shot, but his gun belt strapped on and his badge gleaming in the afternoon sun. The lawman, who'd sold his soul to Fletcher, was making one last play for redemption. "Fletcher Rawlins," Morrison called out, his voice carrying the authority of his office despite his obvious pain. "By the power vested in me by the territory of Montana, you are under arrest for kidnapping, assault, and conspiracy to commit murder." Fletcher's confident expression wavered as he realized the extent of the opposition he faced. This wasn't just one aging outlaw making a desperate last stand. This was an entire community finally finding the courage to resist his tyranny. The numerical advantage he'd counted on was evaporating as more townspeople revealed themselves. Armed and ready to fight. "You think these shopkeepers and farmers can stand against professional killers?" Fletcher demanded, though his voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. "You think a corrupt sheriff can suddenly grow a conscience and make everything right?" "I think," Isaac replied, checking the position of the sun against the western horizon, "that you're about to find out what happens when decent people finally get tired of being pushed around. The question is, Fletcher, are you ready to pay the real price of the war you started?" Margaret's wedding ring was now in Catherine's possession, a symbol of love that had transcended death itself. Isaac had carried that ring for 3 years as a reminder of the life he'd almost had. But now it served a different purpose, proof that some promises were worth keeping no matter what the cost. The sun continued its descent toward the horizon, marking time toward a confrontation that would determine not just the fate of two sisters, but the future of an entire community. In the distance, thunder rumbled across the valley, promising a storm that would wash the dust of Millbrook with something darker than rain. Fletcher's kingdom of fear was crumbling around him, undermined by the very people he'd thought too weak to resist his will. The Ghost Rider was riding again, but this time he wasn't alone. He was leading an army of ordinary people who'd discovered that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to do what was right despite it. The afternoon shadows lengthened as Isaac retreated to his forge, ostensibly to consider Fletcher's ultimatum, but actually to finalize preparations for the battle he knew was coming. The townspeople had dispersed with careful casualness, but Isaac could feel their presence like a gathering storm. Armed citizens taking positions, checking weapons, steeling themselves for violence most had never imagined they'd be called upon to face. Dr. Kane arrived first, slipping through the forge's back entrance with the practiced stealth of a man who'd learned discretion during his years treating Fletcher's victims. The old physician carried more than his medical bag. Slung across his shoulder was a rifle that looked well-maintained despite its age, and his coat pockets bulged with ammunition and field dressings. "I found Margaret's journal," Kane said without preamble, setting a leather-bound book on Isaac's workbench beside the array of weapons. Beth hid it exactly where her mother said she would, inside the false bottom of her medical chest. "Isaac, what's written in here?" "It's enough to hang Fletcher and half his men for murder and conspiracy." Isaac opened the journal with reverent hands, Margaret's familiar handwriting flowing across pages that documented months of careful observation and growing fear. She'd recorded Fletcher's visits to her home, the strange symptoms that had begun appearing after she'd started investigating his land acquisitions, the gradual poisoning that had slowly destroyed her body while sharpening her mind's clarity about the danger he represented. "March 15th, Isaac read aloud. "Fletcher brought tea again today, that expensive blend from back east. Insisted I drink it while he talked about his plans for the valley. Feel dizzy afterward, nauseous. Beginning to suspect this isn't coincidence. Keep reading," Kane urged grimly. "It gets worse." Page after page revealed Margaret's growing understanding of her situation. She documented Fletcher's threats against other townspeople, his use of federal land grants obtained through bribery, his systematic elimination of anyone who posed a threat to his expanding empire. Most damning were her observations about Sheriff Morrison's gambling debts and Dr. Kane's forced cooperation in covering up suspicious deaths. "She knew she was dying," Isaac said, his voice thick with emotion. "She knew Fletcher was killing her, but she kept documenting everything anyway. She was building a case even as the poison ate away at her life." Kane nodded heavily. "Margaret was the smartest woman I've ever known, and the bravest. She made me promise to give this journal to you only if her daughters were threatened. She knew what you'd do with the information, knew it would probably mean your death. But she also knew it might be the only way to stop Fletcher's rampage through this community." A soft knock at the forge door interrupted their conversation. Pastor Wells entered quietly, his usually gentle face set with grim determination. Behind him came Ramon Santos and 3 other men, farmers and shopkeepers who'd never fired shots in anger, but who'd reached the limit of their tolerance for Fletcher's oppression. "How many can we count on?" Isaac asked without preamble. 18 men with rifles," Wells replied, consulting a piece of paper covered with names. 6 more with pistols. Ruth Anderson has that buffalo gun of hers on the saloon balcony. She can hit a silver dollar at 200 yards. The children have slingshots and know how to use them for distraction. Mrs. Chen and the other women are preparing bandages and gathering supplies." Isaac studied the numbers with the calculating mind of a man who'd spent years planning impossible victories against superior forces. "Fletcher has at least 20 professional gunmen, probably more by now. They're better trained, better armed, and they've got the advantage of position in the town square. This won't be like the stories people tell about the Ghost Rider. This will be bloody, messy, and most of us probably won't survive it. Ramon Santos stepped forward, his weathered hands steady despite the fear Isaac could see in his eyes. "Senor Isaac, my boy Miguel loves Miss Catherine like a second mother. She taught him to read when everyone else said he was too stupid to learn. If she dies because we were too afraid to fight, how do I explain that to him? How do I live with myself?" The other men nodded agreement, their faces reflecting Santos's mixture of terror and determination. These weren't warriors or desperados, they were decent people pushed beyond endurance, fathers and husbands willing to risk everything, for two women who'd shown them kindness. In a world grown cruel, Isaac reached under his workbench and withdrew a rolled bundle of papers, maps he'd drawn over the years, documenting every building, alley, and potential position in Millbrook. His outlaw experience had taught him to always know the terrain, to understand how a place could be defended or attacked. "If we're going to do this," Isaac said, spreading the maps across his workbench, "we need to be smart about it. Fletcher's counting on us to make a frontal assault, to let emotion override tactics. Instead, we're going to use the town against him." He pointed to various positions on the map. "Ruth's already in the saloon. She can cover the square's north side. Pastor Wells, I want you and 3 men in the church bell tower. You'll have the best view of Fletcher's positions and can direct the others. Dr. Kane, your clinic gives you a clear shot at the gallows if they try to hang the girls. You're our best chance to prevent it." Kane studied his assigned position, then nodded grimly. "I can make that shot. Been practicing on coyotes for years. Figure Fletcher's men aren't much different." Isaac felt a grim smile tug at his lips. The mild-mannered physician was revealing depths that Fletcher had never suspected, showing the same hidden strength that seemed to run through everyone in this supposedly broken community. "The key," Isaac continued, "is coordination. Fletcher's men are used to terrorizing individuals, picking off isolated targets. They're not prepared for organized resistance, for a community that fights as one unit. We hit them from multiple directions simultaneously, confuse them, make them react instead of acting." Young Tommy Hartwell appeared in the doorway, his face flushed from running. "Mr. Isaac, something's happening in the square. Fletcher's brought in more men. Looks like maybe 10 or 12 additional riders. And he's moved Miss Catherine and Miss Beth to the gallows platform. Says he's tired of waiting for your answer." Isaac felt ice form in his chest. Fletcher was forcing the timeline, probably sensing the growing resistance around him. The careful plans Isaac had been developing would need to be implemented immediately, before the sisters paid the price for the community's courage. "Time's up," Isaac said, checking the loads in his revolvers with practiced efficiency. "Everyone to your positions. Remember, we're not trying to win a war here. Just rescue 2 women and maybe teach a tyrant that decent people won't be pushed around forever." Pastor Wells clasped Isaac's shoulder, his grip firm, despite the tremor Isaac could feel in the older man's hands. "Margaret would be proud of what you're doing. She always believed you could use your gifts for something righteous." Isaac thought about the journal lying open on his workbench, Margaret's careful documentation of her own murder written in her precise handwriting. She died trying to build evidence against Fletcher, sacrificing her life to leave her daughters a weapon they could use against their tormentor. Now it was Isaac's turn to honor her sacrifice, to keep the promise he'd made to a dying woman who'd seen something worth saving in a killer's blackened soul. "Let's go save those girls," Isaac said, strapping on his gun belt for the first time in 5 years. The leather felt familiar against his hips, the weight of the revolvers, a comfortable reminder of skills he'd never entirely forgotten. The Ghost Rider was riding again, but this time he wouldn't ride alone. Outside, the sun continued its descent toward the horizon, marking time toward a confrontation that would determine whether Millbrook remained Fletcher's personal kingdom or became something more. A community where good people could make a stand and maybe, just maybe, win. The sun hung lower in the western sky as Isaac made his way through Millbrook's back alleys, moving with the silent efficiency that had once made him the most feared outlaw in 3 territories. His years as a peaceful blacksmith had softened his body, but not his instincts. He still knew how to read shadows, how to move without disturbing dust, how to approach dangerous men without betraying his presence. Fletcher's overconfidence had become his weakness. The land barons' hired guns were positioned for intimidation rather than defense, focused on the crowd in the town square rather than watching for threats from unexpected directions. They'd grown comfortable in their role as oppressors, secure in the knowledge that no one in Millbrook possessed the skill or courage to challenge them directly. Isaac paused behind the general store, close enough to the square to hear Fletcher's voice booming across the assembled townspeople. The man was delivering what sounded like a speech, probably explaining his version of justice to the captive audience. Isaac couldn't make out the words, but the tone carried clearly, self-righteous, pompous, and completely secure in his own power. A faded wanted poster fluttered in the evening breeze, caught against the store's back wall. Isaac's breath caught as he recognized the image, his own face from 15 years ago, younger and harder, with the cold eyes of a man who killed for money rather than principle. The poster was weathered almost beyond recognition, but the words, "Ghost Rider," were still visible across the top, along with a reward amount that would have been impressive even by today's standards. Fletcher had kept this poster, probably as some kind of trophy or insurance policy. It represented everything Isaac had been, a killer without conscience, a man who solved problems with violence and asked questions later. The irony wasn't lost on him that Fletcher was about to discover the difference between the Ghost Rider who'd worked for profit and the one who fought for love. "Isaac Ramsey," a voice called from behind him, soft but carrying the unmistakable authority of a gun being cocked. Isaac turned slowly, hands held carefully away from his weapons. Sheriff Tom Morrison stood in the alley's mouth, his badge catching the fading sunlight and his face twisted with the desperate look of a man who'd sold his soul and was trying to collect the final payment. "Tom," Isaac acknowledged, studying the sheriff's stance and weapon positioning. Morrison was nervous, probably drunk, and definitely not as skilled with his gun as he wanted people to believe. "Come to arrest me for disturbing the peace? Fletcher wants to see you," Morrison said, his voice slurred just enough to confirm Isaac's suspicion about the drinking. "Says you've got a choice to make and he's tired of waiting. Time to face the music, Ghost Rider." Isaac could smell the whiskey on Morrison's breath from 6 feet away, could see the slight tremor in the sheriff's gun hand that spoke of a man pushed beyond his competence. This was Fletcher's insurance policy: send the local law to bring in the dangerous outlaw. Let Morrison take the risk while Fletcher maintained his distance. "You know what Fletcher did to Margaret," Isaac said conversationally, taking a small step closer. "Dr. Kane told me about the symptoms, about how she died. Poison, Tom, slow, painful, deliberate murder. And you helped cover it up." Morrison's face went pale, but his gun never wavered. "That's not— She was sick. Everyone knew she was sick." "Consumption," Doc Kane said. "Natural causes." "Margaret documented everything in a medical journal," Isaac continued, taking another step. "Every visit Fletcher made, every cup of tea he brought her, every symptom that appeared afterward. She knew she was being murdered, Tom, and she wrote it all down. Evidence that could hang him and everyone who helped him." The sheriff's gun hand was shaking noticeably now, fear and whiskey combining to destroy whatever confidence Morrison had possessed. "You're lying." "Fletcher wouldn't. He's a businessman, not a killer." Isaac smiled, and it was the smile that had once made hardened outlaws reconsider their career choices. "Fletcher's killed more people than I ever did, Tom. The difference is, I never pretended to be righteous while I was doing it." In one fluid motion, Isaac stepped sideways and drew his revolver, the movement faster than Morrison's alcohol-clouded reflexes could follow. The sheriff's shot went wide, shattering a window in the store behind Isaac, while Isaac's bullet took Morrison in the shoulder with surgical precision, enough to disable him without killing him. Morrison dropped his gun and fell to his knees, clutching his wounded shoulder and staring up at Isaac with the wide eyes of a man who'd just seen a legend come to life. "Jesus," he whispered. "The stories were true. You really are faster than lightning." The stories were about a man who killed for money, Isaac replied, holstering his weapon. Tonight you're dealing with someone who kills for love. Much more dangerous, Tom. You'd better hope Fletcher understands the difference. Isaac left Morrison bleeding in the alley and continued his approach to the town square. The gunshot would have alerted Fletcher's men, but that was part of the plan. Create chaos, force them to react, disrupt their carefully maintained control of the situation. As he rounded the corner into the square, Isaac could see the full scope of Fletcher's theatre. The sisters knelt on the gallows platform, their hands still bound, but their eyes alert and focused. Catherine had worked the lockpick Isaac had given her, loosening her bonds enough to move quickly when the opportunity arose. Beth was positioned to support her sister, ready to run the moment their chance came. Fletcher stood beside the gallows with theatrical grandeur, his expensive suit unmarked by the dust that covered everyone else in the square. His hired guns were positioned around the platform in a loose semicircle, confident in their numbers and firepower. The townspeople had been herded into a tight group where they could be easily watched and controlled. "See, Isaac," Fletcher called out, his voice carrying false warmth. "I was beginning to think you'd decided to run rather than face your responsibilities. Sheriff Morrison was supposed to escort you here. I trust he didn't give you any trouble?" "Tom's taking a little rest," Isaac replied, walking into the square with his hands visible but ready. "Seems he had an accident." Fletcher's smile faltered slightly as he realized what had happened. "No matter. You're here now, and that's what matters. Time to make your choice, Isaac. Which sister lives and which one dies? The sun's getting low, and I'm not a patient man." Isaac stopped 20 feet from the gallows, close enough to act, but far enough to avoid being overwhelmed by Fletcher's men. Around the square, he could see his allies taking their positions, a glint of metal from the church bell tower where Pastor Wells waited with his rifle. A shadow moving behind the saloon windows where Ruth Anderson prepared for battle. "I've got a better idea," Isaac said, his voice carrying clearly across the square. "How about we settle this between men? You and me, Fletcher. Winner takes all." Fletcher laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. "You think this is some kind of romantic duel? This isn't the Old West, Isaac. This is business. Choose a sister or watch them both hang. Those are your only options." Isaac's hand drifted toward his gun, the movement casual but unmistakable. "Actually, Fletcher, I think you're wrong about that. See, I've been thinking about promises lately. The kind of promises a man makes to a dying woman. The kind he keeps even when it costs him everything." He drew Margaret's wedding ring from his pocket, holding it up so the fading sunlight caught its surface. "I bought this for Margaret 3 years ago. Was going to ask her to marry me once she got better. But you made sure that never happened, didn't you? Poisoned her slowly, made her suffer while you stole her life one drop at a time." Fletcher's face went deadly pale, his composure cracking for the first time. "You can't prove anything. Margaret died of consumption. Everyone knows that. Her medical journal says otherwise," Isaac replied, enjoying the fear that was beginning to show in Fletcher's eyes. "Every symptom documented, every visit you made, every cup of poisoned tea you brought her. She knew what you were doing, Fletcher, and she left evidence that will hang you higher than a Sunday sermon." The hired guns were getting nervous now, sensing the change in their employer's demeanor. Isaac could see them shifting positions, checking weapons, preparing for violence. The townspeople in the square were growing restless too, understanding that the moment of truth was approaching. "It doesn't matter," Fletcher said, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "Even if such evidence existed, you'll all be dead before it reaches the territorial authorities. Choose a sister, Isaac. Choose now, or I'll hang them both and make you watch." Isaac smiled again, and this time it was the expression of a man who just realized he held all the cards. "You know what the difference is between you and me, Fletcher? You kill people because it's profitable. I kill people because they need killing." Thunder rumbled across the valley as storm clouds gathered on the horizon, promising a tempest that would wash Millbrook clean of the corruption that had poisoned it for too long. Isaac could feel the electricity in the air, the tension that preceded violence, the moment when words failed and actions spoke with deadly clarity. "Time's up," Isaac said, his hand hovering over his gun. "Let's see what kind of man you really are when you can't hide behind hired killers and intimidation." The final confrontation was about to begin, and Isaac knew that whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine not just the fate of Margaret's daughters, but the soul of an entire community that had finally found the courage to stand against evil. The storm clouds gathering overhead seemed to mirror the tension crackling through the town square as Isaac faced Fletcher across 20 feet of dusty ground. The hired guns flanking the gallows platform fingered their weapons nervously, sensing that their employer's carefully orchestrated theater was spiraling beyond his control. In the fading light, the nooses swaying above Catherine and Beth cast twisted shadows that danced like harbingers of violence. Fletcher's pale eyes darted between Isaac and the surrounding buildings, finally understanding that his numerical advantage might not be as decisive as he'd believed. The townspeople he'd dismissed as sheep were showing signs of organization, of purpose, of the kind of desperate courage that made ordinary people dangerous. "You think you're clever, don't you?" Fletcher said, his voice carrying a new edge of genuine anger. "Think you can waltz back into town after 5 years of playing blacksmith and intimidate me with ghost stories and empty threats? I know what you were, Isaac, and I know what you've become. A broken down has been trying to recapture past glory." Isaac's smile never wavered, though his eyes had taken on the cold calculation that had once made him the most feared man in 3 territories. "Maybe you're right, Fletcher. Maybe I am just a broken-down blacksmith. But broken things can still be dangerous if you don't handle them carefully." That's when Beth Morrison did. Something that changed everything. The younger sister had been working at her bonds with quiet desperation, using the medical knowledge her mother had passed down to manipulate the rope knots with the same precision she applied to sutures and bandages. While everyone's attention was focused on the confrontation between Isaac and Fletcher, Beth had managed to free her hands completely, but instead of running, instead of seeking safety, she did something that no one, not Isaac, not Fletcher, not even Catherine, had expected. She lunged toward the small wooden box that Fletcher kept beside the gallows platform, the box that contained his personal effects and the trophies he'd collected from his various conquests. "Beth, no!" Catherine screamed, but her sister was already moving, driven by a revelation that had been building in her mind throughout their captivity. Beth's hands closed around a familiar leather-bound journal, her mother's medical journal, the one Isaac and Dr. Kane thought was hidden safely in the clinic. But this wasn't just any copy of Margaret's documentation. This was the original, and Fletcher had been carrying it with him like a grotesque souvenir of his victory over the woman who dared to investigate his crimes. "You want to know the truth?" Beth cried out, her voice carrying across the square with surprising strength for someone who'd always been the quieter sister. "The truth is that Fletcher Rawlins didn't just poison our mother. He bragged about it to her while she was dying." Fletcher's face went white as Beth opened the journal to pages that Isaac had never seen, entries that Margaret had made during her final days when the poison had reached her brain and loosened her inhibitions about documenting the most damning evidence of all. "March 28th, Beth read aloud, her voice shaking but determined. "Fletcher visited again today. Told me he's been putting arsenic in my tea for 6 months. Says he's going to marry Catherine once I'm gone, make her his property the way he's made everything else in this valley his property." I pretended to be too weak to understand, but I wrote down every word. The hired guns were looking at Fletcher with new uncertainty, realizing that their employer might be more of a liability than they'd bargained for. Professional killers had their own code. Murder for money was one thing, but the slow poisoning of an innocent woman crossed lines that even hardened criminals respected. Fletcher's composure cracked completely. "Give me that book," he snarled, drawing his own pistol and pointing it at Beth. "Those are the ravings of a dying woman, hallucinations brought on by fever and medication. No one will believe. I'll believe them." interrupted a new voice from the edge of the square. Everyone turned to see a man in a federal marshal's uniform stepping out from behind the general store, his badge gleaming in the fading light. Behind him came three more men, all armed and all wearing the same stern expression of law enforcement officers who'd traveled a long way to arrest dangerous criminals. Marshal Wade Colton was a legend in his own right, a man who'd brought order to some of the wildest territories in the West through a combination of fair dealing and deadly accuracy with his weapons. His presence in Millbrook could mean only one thing. Someone had already sent Margaret's evidence to the territorial authorities, and the federal government was finally taking an interest in Fletcher Rawlins' activities. "Marshal Colton," Fletcher said, his voice carefully controlled, despite the sweat beading on his forehead. "What brings federal law enforcement to our little community? I wasn't aware we'd requested territorial intervention." Colton smiled, but it was the cold expression of a predator who'd cornered his prey. "We received some interesting correspondence about federal land grants being obtained through fraudulent means. Mr. Rawlins, seems someone's been bribing government officials to secure territory that rightfully belongs to the people of this territory." He held up a thick envelope, its official seals clearly visible even from a distance. "This contains copies of every illegal transaction you've made over the past 3 years, along with testimony from witnesses in the territorial capital who were willing to discuss your business methods in exchange for immunity from prosecution." Isaac felt his world shift as he realized what had happened. Someone had beaten him to the punch, had already begun the legal process that would bring Fletcher down through official channels rather than vigilante justice. But who? Who in Millbrook had the connections and knowledge necessary to reach the federal authorities? The answer came from an unexpected source. Henry Caldwell, the mild-mannered banker who'd always seemed too frightened to oppose Fletcher directly, stepped forward from the crowd with a document case in his hands. "I sent the evidence," Caldwell announced, his quiet voice carrying clearly in the stunned silence. 3 months ago, when Fletcher forced me to help him launder money from his illegal land sales, I made copies of everything: transaction records, correspondence with federal officials, documentation of bribes and intimidation. I sent it all to Marshal Colton, along with a formal request for investigation." Fletcher whirled on Caldwell with murderous rage. "You little worm. I made you rich, gave you more business than you'd ever dreamed of, and this is how you repay me." "You made me an accessory to theft and murder," Caldwell replied with quiet dignity. "When Margaret Morrison died, and I realized what you'd done to her, I knew I couldn't be part of your crimes anymore." "She was a good woman, Fletcher. She deserved better than being poisoned by a monster." Isaac watched this revelation unfold with a mixture of relief and frustration. Relief that justice might finally be served through legal channels, frustration that his opportunity for personal vengeance was slipping away. The Ghost Rider in him wanted blood, wanted Fletcher to pay for Margaret's death with violence rather than legal proceedings. But then Fletcher made a decision that brought all the violence Isaac could have wanted. "If I'm going down," Fletcher snarled, raising his pistol toward the sisters on the gallows platform, "I'm taking these bitches with me. Nobody makes a fool of Fletcher Rawlins and lives to tell about it." The shot rang out across the square, but it didn't come from Fletcher's gun. Isaac had drawn and fired in one fluid motion, his bullet taking Fletcher's weapon from his hand with the kind of precision that legends were built on. Fletcher screamed as his pistol went flying, his right hand shattered by Isaac's perfectly placed shot. Chaos erupted in the square as Fletcher's hired guns realized their employer was finished and began choosing sides. Some threw down their weapons, unwilling to fight federal marshals for a man who was clearly going to prison. Others decided to go down fighting, drawing their guns and opening fire on anyone wearing a badge. Marshal Colton and his men took cover behind whatever they could find, returning fire with the professional efficiency of experienced lawmen. The townspeople scattered, some running for safety while others took up positions to support the federal officers. Isaac found himself in the middle of the firestorm, his old instincts taking over as he moved through the battle like a deadly shadow. His guns spoke with the voice of controlled violence, each shot carefully placed to disable rather than kill when possible. This wasn't the indiscriminate slaughter of his outlaw days. This was the precise application of force in service of justice. Catherine and Beth had taken shelter behind the gallows platform, using the wooden structure for protection while they watched Isaac work. Both sisters stared in amazement as the mild-mannered blacksmith they'd known for years revealed himself to be everything the Ghost Rider stories had claimed: faster than lightning, deadly as winter, and absolutely unstoppable when he was fighting for something he believed in. The battle was brief but intense, ending when the last of Fletcher's hired guns either surrendered or fell to the combined firepower of Isaac, the federal marshals, and the armed townspeople. In the sudden silence that followed, Fletcher knelt in the dust, clutching his ruined hand, his empire of fear and intimidation crumbling around him like a house built on sand. Marshal Colton approached Isaac carefully, his weapon holstered, but his hand ready to draw if necessary. "Isaac Ramsey, also known as the Ghost Rider, I have federal warrants for your arrest on charges of robbery, murder, and terrorizing interstate commerce. But considering your cooperation in this matter and the circumstances involved, I'm prepared to discuss terms." Isaac smiled, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders that he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying. "Marshal, I think we might have a lot to discuss. But first, let me help you with these prisoners. Something tells me Fletcher's going to have plenty of interesting things to say about his business partners once he realizes how much trouble he's really in." The storm that had been gathering finally broke, sending rain down on Millbrook's dusty streets and washing away the blood that had been spilled in the name of justice. Isaac looked up at the sky, feeling Margaret's presence in the cool drops that touched his face, and knew that he'd finally kept his promise to the woman who'd shown him that redemption was possible, even for the most unlikely souls. The rain fell steadily on Millbrook as the immediate aftermath of the gunfight settled into a tense calm. Fletcher Rawlins sat in the mud of the town square, his shattered hand wrapped in bandages that Dr. Kane had applied with more professional duty than compassion. Blood and rainwater mixed in the dust around him, creating dark stains that seemed to symbolize the end of his corrupt reign over the valley. Marshal Colton stood over the fallen land baron, rain dripping from the brim of his hat as he read from an official document that would reshape the future of everyone in Millbrook. "Fletcher Rawlins, by the authority vested in me by the territory of Montana, you are under arrest for conspiracy to defraud the federal government, bribery of public officials, extortion, intimidation of witnesses, and the murder of Margaret Morrison." Isaac watched from beside the sisters, his father's Colt revolver still warm in his hand. The weapon that had made him famous as the Ghost Rider felt different now, not the tool of an outlaw seeking profit, but the instrument of justice in service of something greater than himself. Catherine and Beth flanked him, both women finally free of their bonds and safe, though their eyes showed the trauma of their ordeal. "There's more," Marshal Colton continued, his voice carrying across the square despite the rain. "We've been investigating your operation for months, Mr. Rawlins. Your federal land grants were obtained through forged documents and bribes totaling over $50,000. Your intimidation campaign against local businesses violated territorial commerce laws. And now we have documentary evidence that you systematically poisoned Margaret Morrison over a period of 6 months. Fletcher's pale eyes blazed with impotent rage as he realized the full scope of his downfall. "You can't prove murder based on the ravings of a dying woman. Any lawyer worth his salt will tear that evidence apart in court." Dr. Kane stepped forward, rain plastering his gray hair to his skull. "Actually, Fletcher, I kept tissue samples from Margaret's autopsy. Unusual precaution for a small-town doctor, but something about her death troubled me. Those samples have been sitting in my clinic for 3 years, preserved in alcohol. Marshal Colton's people tested them yesterday. Arsenic levels high enough to kill a horse. Isaac felt a cold satisfaction watching Fletcher's composure finally crack completely. The man who terrorized an entire community with his wealth and connections was discovering that justice, when properly applied, was more powerful than any individual's ability to corrupt it. But even as Fletcher was being led away in shackles, Isaac knew the real confrontation was still ahead of him. Marshal Colton had been patient during the crisis, focused on apprehending the primary criminals. But Isaac could see the federal lawman's attention turning toward him with the inevitable weight of long-delayed justice. "Walk with me." "Isaac," Colton said, his tone more request than command. "We need to discuss your situation." They moved away from the crowd, Isaac's boots splashing through puddles that reflected the storm-darkened sky. The marshal was a man in his 50s, weathered by years of frontier law enforcement, with the kind of steady presence that came from facing dangerous men and emerging victorious. 15 years, Colton said without preamble. 15 years since the Ghost Rider disappeared after that business in Colorado Territory. Most folks figured you were dead, that many enemies don't usually let a man retire peacefully. Isaac's hand rested casually near his gun, not from any intention to resist, but from habits too deeply ingrained to abandon. "I tried to be dead, Marshal. Buried that man as deep as I could and built something better on top of the grave. Banker Caldwell tells me you've been an exemplary citizen here. Honest work, fair dealing, helped people when they needed it. Dr. Kane says you've been taking care of Margaret Morrison's daughters like they were your own family. Pastor Wells claims you've found genuine redemption." They paused beside Isaac's forge, the building that had sheltered his transformation from killer to craftsman. The anvil sat silent and cold, rainwater pooling in its worn surface where Isaac had shaped countless horseshoes and tools during his years of honest labor. "I want to believe in redemption," Colton continued. "God knows this frontier needs more examples of men who can change, who can choose something better than violence and greed. But I've also got warrants with your name on them, crimes that demand justice, regardless of how much good you've done since." Isaac nodded, understanding the Marshal's dilemma. "How many people did the Ghost Rider kill, Marshal? How many robberies? How many towns terrorized? Because I remember every face, every shot fired, every family destroyed by my greed. Redemption doesn't erase those sins. It just gives them purpose. 11 confirmed kills," Colton replied. 23 stagecoach robberies, 6 bank jobs, intimidation of witnesses in dozens of cases. But here's what's interesting, Isaac. Most of your victims were men like Fletcher Rawlins. Corrupt officials, crooked businessmen, criminals preying on honest folks. You were a killer, but you had a code. Isaac felt Margaret's wedding ring pressing against his chest, warm despite the cold rain. He'd carried that symbol of lost love for 3 years, along with her blood-stained letter and the promise that had ultimately led him to this moment. The Ghost Rider had no code, Isaac said quietly. He killed for money and told himself pretty stories about justice to make the blood easier to swallow. The man standing here now, he's different. He's learned the difference between vengeance and justice, between taking a life and saving one. Thunder rumbled overhead as the storm intensified, lightning illuminating the darkened square where townspeople were helping the wounded and securing Fletcher's remaining men. Isaac could see Catherine and Beth in the distance, both women watching his conversation with the marshal with obvious concern. "I'm prepared to offer you a deal," Colton said after a long moment. "Cooperation in testifying against Fletcher and his network of corrupt officials in exchange for federal amnesty on your outstanding warrants. The territorial government needs men like you, Isaac, men who understand the criminal mind but have chosen to serve justice instead of profit." Isaac felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of tension he'd carried for 15 years. "What kind of service are we talking about, Marshal?" "Deputy U.S. Marshal, working undercover to infiltrate and destroy criminal organizations throughout the territory. Dangerous work, but legal work. A chance to use your skills and reputation for something genuinely righteous. The offer hung between them like a bridge across the chasm of Isaac's past, a way forward that honored both his crimes and his redemption. He thought about Margaret's faith in his capacity for good, about the promise he'd made to protect her daughters, about the community that had accepted him despite knowing his history. "I need some time to consider," Isaac said finally. "There are people here who depend on me, obligations I can't abandon lightly." Colton nodded, understanding. "Take the time you need, but understand, this offer expires when I leave Millbrook. Federal amnesty isn't something that comes around twice." As if summoned by their conversation, Catherine and Beth approached through the rain, both women moving with the determined stride of people who'd made important decisions. Catherine's green eyes blazed with the same fierce intelligence that had reminded Isaac so powerfully of her mother, while Beth carried herself with the quiet strength of someone who'd found courage in the face of mortal terror. "Isaac," Catherine said without preamble, "we heard what Marshal Colton offered you. We want you to take it." Isaac felt his heart clench. "Catherine, I can't leave you and Beth alone. I made a promise to your mother, a promise to protect us," Beth interrupted gently. "And you've kept that promise. But we're not children anymore, Isaac. We're grown women who can make our own choices and fight our own battles. What we can't do is live with the knowledge that we held you back from serving a greater purpose." Catherine nodded agreement, rain streaming down her face like tears. "Our mother saw something special in you, something worth saving. She'd want you to use your gifts to help others the way you helped us. That's not abandoning us. That's honoring her memory." Dr. Kane approached through the storm, his medical bag slung over his shoulder and a thoughtful expression on his weathered face. "Isaac, I've been thinking about what happens next, about how Millbrook rebuilds after Fletcher's downfall. This community needs leaders, people who understand both justice and mercy." "What are you getting at, Doc?" "I'm getting old," Kane replied with a tired smile. "My hands aren't as steady as they once were. My eyes aren't as sharp. Beth here has learned more medicine in 3 years than most doctors acquire in a decade. She could take over my practice, serve this community as its official physician." Beth's face lit up with surprise and gratitude. "Dr. Kane, I don't have formal training. No medical school credentials." "You have something more valuable," Kane interrupted. "You have compassion, intelligence, and hands that were born to heal. With my recommendation and Marshal Colton's influence, we can arrange for you to receive official certification. Millbrook needs you, Beth. More than that, you need to be needed." Isaac looked around at the faces surrounding him, the Marshal offering redemption, the sisters releasing him from his promise, the old doctor providing a path forward for Beth's future. Even in the storm's fury, he could sense Margaret's presence, her gentle spirit guiding events toward the resolution she'd always believed possible. Pastor Wells appeared from the direction of his church, his usually immaculate clothes soaked with rain, but his face shining with quiet joy. "Isaac, I wanted you to know. The Territorial Church Authority has agreed to fund a new school building. Catherine will have proper facilities, real supplies, everything she needs to give these children the education they deserve." "How?" Catherine asked, amazement clear in her voice. "Your mother's journal documented more than Fletcher's crimes," Wells replied. "It also contained evidence of federal funds that were supposed to go to territorial education, but were diverted to Fletcher's private projects. That money is being returned with interest, and it's going exactly where Margaret always wanted it to go." Isaac felt the weight of 15 years' guilt beginning to lift from his shoulders, replaced by something he'd almost forgotten: how to feel hope. Margaret's legacy wasn't just the evidence that had destroyed Fletcher, but the foundation for a better future that she'd built with her final breaths. "Marshal," Isaac said, turning to face Colton directly, "I accept your offer, but I have conditions." "I'm listening." "Millbrook gets federal protection during the transition. These people took risks to help me, and I won't see them punished for it. Catherine and Beth receive any assistance they need to establish their new careers, and I want the right to return here when my service is complete, to retire in the place where I learned what redemption really means." Colton extended his hand, and Isaac grasped it firmly. "Deal." "Welcome to federal law enforcement, Deputy Marshal Ramsey. Something tells me the criminals of this territory are about to get a very unpleasant surprise." As the storm began to clear and the first rays of sunset broke through the clouds, Isaac realized that Margaret's final gift to him wasn't just the chance to save her daughters, but the opportunity to transform his violent legacy into something worthy of the love she'd shown him. The Ghost Rider was riding toward his final sunset, but from those ashes something better would rise. 2 days after Fletcher's arrest, Isaac stood in the doorway of Catherine's schoolhouse, watching smoke rise from the ruins of what had been her pride and joy. Fletcher's final act of spite had been carried out by one of his men who'd escaped the marshal's dragnet, a torch thrown through the window in the dead of night, destroying years of careful work and the dreams of an entire generation of children. The building was a total loss. Charred timbers jutted from the foundation like broken bones, and the smell of burned books and melted slate boards hung heavy in the morning air. Catherine knelt in the ashes, her hands black with soot, as she searched through the debris for anything that might be salvaged. "The children's drawings," she murmured, tears cutting clean tracks through the grime on her face. They made drawings for their families, spent weeks working on them. Now they're all gone. Isaac's jaw tightened as he watched her grief. Fletcher might be in chains, but his poison was still working through Millbrook like a disease. The man's influence had corrupted more than just officials and businessmen. It had created a network of hatred that would take years to completely root out. "We'll rebuild," Isaac said, kneeling beside her in the ruins. "The Territorial Education Fund will provide better materials than you ever had before. This is a setback, not an ending." Catherine looked up at him, her green eyes reflecting a pain that went deeper than the loss of a building. "It's not just the school, Isaac. It's what it represented. Hope for something better, proof that good things could survive in this place. How do I explain to the children that monsters can destroy their dreams whenever they choose?" Before Isaac could answer, young Tommy Hartwell came running up the street, his face flushed with excitement rather than the despair that had marked the last few days. Behind him came the other students, Sarah Chen, Miguel Santos, little Annie Murphy, and a dozen more children who'd made Catherine's schoolhouse the center of their world. "Miss Catherine," Tommy called out, his voice bright with determination. "We heard what happened, but we don't care. We brought our own slate boards, our own books. We can learn anywhere you want to teach us." The children gathered around their teacher, their faces showing the kind of fierce loyalty that couldn't be destroyed by fire or intimidation. Sarah Chen stepped forward, holding out a carefully wrapped bundle. "We saved our drawings," she announced proudly. "Tommy told us to take them home every day for safekeeping. We knew someone might try to hurt the school, so we protected the important things." Catherine's composure cracked as she unwrapped the bundle to find dozens of children's drawings. Crude but heartfelt depictions of their families, their dreams, their hopes for the future. These weren't just art projects, they were declarations of faith in tomorrow, proof that Fletcher's darkness hadn't extinguished the light these young souls carried. Isaac felt his chest tighten as he watched the interaction. These children understood something that adults often forgot, that buildings could be burned, but the relationships and knowledge they contained were indestructible as long as people were willing to fight for them. "Where will we hold classes?" Catherine asked, wiping tears from her eyes as she looked around at the eager young faces. "The church," called out Pastor Wells, approaching with a key in his hand. "The building is yours for as long as you need it. God's house should serve his people's children." Dr. Kane joined the growing group, his medical bag replaced by a stack of books. "I have texts on history, science, literature, everything I've collected over 40 years of practice. Consider them a loan to the new school, wherever it ends up being built." Isaac watched this spontaneous gathering with growing amazement. Fletcher had tried to break the community's spirit by destroying its symbol of hope. But instead he'd created something stronger, a determination that transcended buildings and materials, rooted in the relationships between people who refused to surrender their dreams. Ruth Anderson arrived with arms full of supplies, paper, pencils, chalk, everything she could gather from the general store's inventory. "Fletcher's accounts are frozen," she announced with grim satisfaction. "But the store's community credit fund has enough to keep the school supplied for months." More townspeople appeared as word spread, each bringing something useful: lumber for temporary desks, blankets for warmth, lanterns for light. The ruins of the schoolhouse were transforming from a symbol of destruction into a rallying point for reconstruction. But even as hope began to bloom again in Millbrook, Isaac could feel darkness gathering on the horizon. Fletcher might be in chains, but his network extended far beyond the valley. There would be retaliation, attempts to free their captured leader, violence directed at anyone who'd participated in his downfall. Marshal Colton approached through the crowd, his face grim with news that Isaac had been expecting. "We've got trouble coming." Fletcher's associates in the territorial capital are mobilizing: corrupt officials, hired guns, even some legitimate businessmen who profited from his operations. They want him freed before he can testify about their involvement. Isaac's hand instinctively moved toward his gun. "How many?" "At least 30 armed men, probably more. They'll be here by nightfall, and they're not coming to negotiate. This is a rescue operation with orders to eliminate witnesses." The crowd around the schoolhouse ruins grew quiet as the marshal's words sank in. These people had risked everything to stand against Fletcher, and now they faced the prospect of paying the ultimate price for their courage. Catherine stood up slowly, her teacher's dignity intact despite the soot staining her clothes. "Then we'll be ready for them. This community has already proven it won't be intimidated by threats and violence." Isaac looked around at the faces surrounding him, men and women who'd found their courage in the crucible of crisis, children who'd learned that dreams were worth fighting for, elderly folks who'd decided they wouldn't live their remaining years in fear. "No," he said firmly, his voice carrying the authority that had once made hardened outlaws obey without question. "This isn't your fight anymore. I'm the one they really want, the Ghost Rider who helped destroy their operation. The rest of you need to get to safety while there's still time." But even as he spoke, Isaac knew his words were falling on deaf ears. These people had tasted victory against tyranny, had discovered their own capacity for heroism. They weren't going to retreat now, not when everything they'd fought for hung in the balance. The sun was setting behind the mountains when Isaac heard the thunder of approaching hoofbeats echoing across the valley. From his position on the church bell tower, he could see the dust cloud rising in the distance, at least 40 riders, moving with the purposeful speed of men who'd come to settle accounts with blood and bullets. Fletcher's rescue party had arrived exactly as Marshal Colton predicted. But they were facing a town that had transformed itself into a fortress of determination. Every building offered defensive positions, every alley provided an escape route, and every citizen had chosen their role in the battle that would determine Millbrook's future. Catherine stood at the base of the church tower, her hand resting on the rope that would ring the bell when the fighting began. Her students had been evacuated to the mine tunnels outside town, but she'd refused to leave, insisting that teachers didn't abandon their communities in times of crisis. "Remember," Isaac called down to her, 3 rings means they've broken through the perimeter. 4 rings means retreat to the secondary positions. And Catherine, if something happens to me, you make sure those children know their school will be rebuilt." She looked up at him with the same fierce determination that had made her mother such a formidable woman. "Nothing's going to happen to you, Isaac Ramsey. You've got too much living left to do." Beth had established a medical station in Dr. Kane's clinic, her hands steady despite the approaching violence. She'd learned more about treating gunshot wounds in the past 3 days than most doctors saw in a year. Tending to the injured from the original confrontation with Fletcher's men, Marshal Colton positioned his federal deputies at strategic points throughout the town, their experience with organized criminals giving them an edge over the typical frontier lawman. But even with their expertise, they were outnumbered nearly 3-1 by Fletcher's approaching reinforcements. "Isaac," Colton called from his position behind the general store. "These aren't hired guns looking for easy money. Intelligence suggests they're military veterans, men who served in the Indian campaigns. They know tactics, coordination, battlefield discipline. This won't be like the shootout in the square." Isaac adjusted his grip on his father's Colt revolver, feeling the familiar weight that had once made him the most feared man in 3 territories. But tonight, he wasn't fighting for profit or reputation. He was fighting for the right of decent people to live without fear, for the future of children who deserved better than Fletcher's world of corruption and intimidation. The riders entered Millbrook from 3 directions, their approach coordinated with military precision. Isaac could see their leader, a hard-faced man in an expensive hat who sat his horse like a cavalry officer. This was Jeremiah Cross, Fletcher's business partner and the architect of the corrupt network that had stretched its tentacles throughout the territory. "People of Millbrook," Cross called out, his voice carrying clearly in the evening air, "we've come for the federal prisoners and the man known as the Ghost Rider. Turn them over peacefully, and no innocent blood will be spilled. Resist, and we'll burn this town to the ground." Isaac's smile was cold as winter wind. These men thought they were dealing with frightened farmers and shopkeepers, not understanding that fear had been burned away by weeks of escalating violence. The community below him had discovered something more powerful than terror. They'd found purpose worth dying for. "Cross!" Isaac shouted back, his voice echoing off the buildings around the square. "Your boss is finished. His crimes are documented, his network is exposed, and his reign of terror is over. Ride away now while you still can." Cross's laugh was harsh and mocking. The famous Ghost Rider, reduced to playing protector for weaklings who can't defend themselves. "You've gone soft, Ramsey. Time was you'd have joined us rather than fight us. Time was. I didn't know the difference between taking a life and saving one." The first shot came from Cross's position, meant more as a signal than a serious attempt to hit Isaac in the bell tower. But it triggered the battle that both sides knew was inevitable. The final confrontation that would determine whether justice or corruption ruled the valley. Isaac's return shot took Cross's hat clean off his head, a demonstration of accuracy that sent the message loud and clear. The Ghost Rider's legendary skills were intact, and he was fighting for keeps. The battle erupted across Millbrook like wildfire. Cross's men charged the main street, while Isaac's allies opened fire from their concealed positions. The church bell began to ring as Catherine pulled the rope, its bronze voice calling the community to its greatest test. From his elevated position, Isaac could see the entire battlefield, coordinating the town's defense with hand signals and precisely placed shots that turned the tide at crucial moments. His guns spoke with deadly authority, each bullet finding its mark with the skill that had made his reputation 15 years ago. But this wasn't the indiscriminate killing of his outlaw days. Every shot was calculated to disable rather than destroy when possible, to protect the innocent while stopping those who would harm them. Isaac had learned the difference between vengeance and justice, between taking a life because you could and taking one because you must. The battle raged through the streets of Millbrook as shadows lengthened and lanterns began flickering in windows. This was more than a rescue attempt. It was a war for the soul of an entire community, fought by people who'd finally found something worth more than their own safety, and in the bell tower of a small frontier church. A man who'd once been the territory's most feared outlaw discovered that redemption wasn't just about changing who you were. It was about choosing what you were willing to fight for. 6 months later, Isaac Ramsey stood in the doorway of Millbrook's new schoolhouse, watching Catherine lead her students through their morning lessons. The building was larger than the old one, constructed with federal education funds that had been recovered from Fletcher's fraudulent accounts. Sunlight streamed through tall windows onto rows of proper desks, shelves lined with new books, and a blackboard that bore the day's arithmetic problems in Catherine's careful script. The bronze bell Isaac had cast in his forge hung in the school's tower, its clear voice marking the hours of learning and hope that filled each day. He'd poured the metal himself, incorporating fragments of the old church bell that had called the community to battle during those dark days when Fletcher's corruption had nearly destroyed everything good about their valley. "Mr. Ramsey," called young Tommy Hartwell, now grown taller and more confident in his role as Catherine's assistant teacher. "Are you going to tell us another story about the old days?" Isaac smiled, settling into the chair that Catherine had reserved for his weekly visits. The children gathered around him with the eager attention they'd shown since learning that their mild-mannered blacksmith had once been a legend of the frontier. But Isaac's stories had evolved over the months, focusing less on the Ghost Rider's violent exploits and more on the lessons he'd learned about the difference between strength and cruelty, between justice and revenge. "Today I want to tell you about promises," Isaac began, his weathered hands clasped in his lap. "About the kind of promises that change a man's life, even when keeping them costs more than he thought he could pay." Through the window, he could see Beth Morrison, now Dr. Beth Morrison, officially certified by the Territorial Medical Board, making her rounds to check on patients throughout the community. She'd taken over Dr. Kane's practice completely, bringing modern medical techniques learned from textbooks provided by the territorial government, along with the compassion that had always been her greatest gift. Marshal Colton had kept his word about Isaac's federal appointment, though the work had taken him far from Millbrook for months at a time. As Deputy U.S. Marshal Isaac Ramsey, he'd helped dismantle 3 major criminal organizations, using his reputation and knowledge of outlaw tactics to infiltrate groups that had terrorized honest citizens across the territory. But the most satisfying cases were the ones that grew directly from Fletcher's arrest. The land baron's testimony, given in exchange for life imprisonment instead of hanging, had exposed a network of corruption that reached into the territorial capital itself. Dozens of officials had been arrested, illegal land grants had been voided, and stolen property had been returned to its rightful owners. Fletcher himself had died in prison 3 months into his sentence, found dead in his cell, under circumstances that suggested other inmates had tired of his arrogant attempts to maintain his superiority even behind bars. Isaac felt no satisfaction in the news. Margaret's killer was gone, but the real victory lay in the community that had survived his tyranny and grown stronger. The schoolhouse door opened as Catherine concluded the morning's lessons, sending her students out to play in the yard that Isaac had helped fence the previous summer. She approached him with the same mixture of affection and exasperated concern that she'd shown since his return from his latest federal assignment. "You look tired," she observed, settling into the chair beside his. "How long has it been since you've slept in your own bed for more than 2 consecutive nights?" Isaac chuckled, recognizing Margaret's protective nature in her eldest daughter's words. "The work is important, Catherine. Every criminal organization we shut down means families like yours can sleep safely. But you're right. I'm getting too old for constant travel." "Marshal Colton told me about your request for reassignment to regional duties," Catherine said, her green eyes reflecting pride and relief in equal measure. "Millbrook needs you here, Isaac. We all need you here." Through the window, Isaac could see the town that had become his true home, flourishing in ways that would have been impossible under Fletcher's reign. New businesses had opened, families had returned to reclaim abandoned properties, and children played in streets that had once been patrolled by armed thugs. Beth appeared in the doorway, her medical bag in hand and a smile brightening her face. "Isaac, you're back!" "Perfect timing. I wanted to show you something." She led them to the clinic, where a new addition was under construction. The territorial government approved funding for a proper hospital. Nothing fancy, but enough beds and equipment to serve the entire valley. Dr. Kane's been helping with the plans. He says it's the culmination of everything he dreamed of when he first came to practice frontier medicine. Isaac felt a deep satisfaction as he looked at the building taking shape. This was Margaret's true legacy, not just the evidence that had destroyed Fletcher. but the foundation for healing and hope that would serve generations of valley residents. That evening, Isaac stood beside Margaret's grave as the sun set behind the mountains. The simple headstone bore her name and dates, along with an inscription that Isaac had chosen carefully. Beloved mother, teacher, and friend, her faith made all things possible. He placed fresh flowers at the base of the stone, wildflowers that Catherine and Beth had picked from the meadow, where their mother had once taught them to identify different species. The wedding ring that Isaac had carried for 3 years now rested in a small box beside the flowers, finally returned to the woman for whom it had been intended. I kept my promise, Isaac said quietly, his words carried away by the evening wind. Catherine's teaching a new generation, showing them that knowledge and compassion can triumph over ignorance and cruelty. Beth's healing people, using her gifts to ease suffering the way you always wanted to do. And I learned the difference between the man I was and the man you believed I could become. A gentle breeze stirred the flowers, and Isaac imagined he could hear Margaret's voice in the whisper of wind through the grass. She'd known this day would come, had planned for it in the careful documentation that had ultimately brought justice to their valley. Her faith in redemption had proven stronger than Fletcher's corruption, her belief in love more enduring than his creed of fear. As darkness settled over Millbrook, lanterns began flickering to life in windows throughout the town. Children finished their evening chores and gathered around family tables for supper. Adults relaxed on front porches, secure in the knowledge that their community was safe and their future was bright. Isaac walked slowly back toward his forge, where a warm meal and comfortable bed awaited his return. The building was both workplace and home now, a symbol of the honest life he'd built on the ashes of his violent past. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There were always corrupt men seeking to prey upon the innocent, always communities in need of protection and justice. But tonight, in a valley where promises were kept and love conquered fear, a former outlaw named Isaac Ramsey could sleep peacefully, knowing that redemption was not just possible, but inevitable for any soul willing to fight for it. The Ghost Rider's legend would live on in stories told around frontier campfires, but the man himself had found something more valuable than reputation or fear. He'd found home, family, and the kind of purpose that made every sacrifice worthwhile. In the distance, the new school bell chimed the hour, its bronze voice carrying across the valley like a promise that tomorrow would bring new opportunities for learning, growing, and becoming the people that love had always believed they could be.